In this video, Pastor David Wilkerson shares how he started Times Square Church in New York City. Stick to the end and hear the testimony of the actor who played Jesus in Jesus Christ Superstar and how he got saved after a demonic encounter.
What is God's answer? What is God's answer to doctrines of covetousness and the lack of sound doctrine and the turning to covetousness by multitudes and multitudes around the world? I'm heartbroken after going all through Europe and England where they're closing churches on all sides. Churches are closing, even in Pentecostal ranks. Yes, God is moving. You see spots and you see places. You go to South America and you see God moving mighty. You go parts of Africa. In Zambia, we had one of the greatest outpourings of Shekinah glory we've ever seen. And we've seen these places. But in the United States, the latest poll shows that in the past 5 years, 10 to 12 American born-again people have stopped going to church. Oh, you'll see mega church here and mega church there. You will find many of these large churches, but American Christians, born-again Christians, are leaving the church by the thousands. When we first went to New York City, the Lord told me to go to New York City and raise up a church in the middle of the city and to confront the sin. I remember the day I've been traveling as an evangelist, and I've been in New York City working with drug addicts for years, and was in the city preaching on the streets 18 years ago. And I was walking on Broadway about 1 o'clock in the morning, and the drug pushers were selling crack cocaine, and their commercial was, "Hey, I've got the good stuff." An American well-known basketball player, Lynn Bias, died of an overdose that week of cocaine. He had just signed a multi-million-dollar contract, and he died of an overdose. And they were saying, "Hey, I've got the good stuff, the stuff that killed Lynn Bias." The commercial was death. And I realized after all my years of working with drug addicts that if I ever lived to see the day that death was the ultimate high, that we were near chaos. And that we were in the last throes of society just slipping out of control. And I began to weep. It was on 42nd Street, the crossroads of the world in Broadway, and I just wept and cried and said, "Oh God, raise up a church and confront it and raise it on Broadway. I'll raise money. I'll do anything to help. I'll do anything to try to help you establish the church." And I went back toward my hotel room where my wife was waiting, and our headquarters was in Texas. We lived in a comfortable home by a lake in the middle of the United States, in a nice, comfortable area, traveling as an evangelist. And said, "Lord, you send somebody, raise up a young man." And the Lord said, "No, you know this city, you do it." I said, "Well, Lord, I'm willing, but how do you tell a wife?" I went back to my hotel room, and my wife was sitting on the edge of the bed. With tears, she said, "Honey, you don't have to tell me. We're coming back to New York and we're going to start a church." And I didn't know anything about taking a poll. I didn't know anything about asking people what they would want, because you can't get in the buildings. They have concierge, they have doormen. You can't even get in the buildings. You can't ask people. You walk the street. All I knew to do was weep. And I didn't know that I was across the street weeping at the very church God would give us, a theater. And for hours just weeping, saying, "God, how do you start a church? And what do I preach?" And the Lord said, "This is Sin City. You confront the sins. And you confront. First, you have to bring the law. You have to let them understand God's attitude towards sin. You have to put a mirror in front of their face so they understand the devastation of sin. And then you bring in the grace. But until they understand the devastation of sin, until they know they're sinners, You ask. In fact, I talked to a pastor friend who knocked on a door here in your city and asked if he could pray about needs. And the man said, well, wait a minute. I have a beautiful home. I have 2 cars. I have a boat. Everything's paid. I have good pay. I don't have any needs. But you see, when I'm walking among transvestites and I'm walking against drug addicts and pushers and you're walking among the most bound sinners and men so dazed by drugs, they banging their head on the curb and trying to, in absolute madness, and men on the streets babbling like idiots. Their minds so fried and out of their minds. What do you preach? And the Lord said, you are going to warn people and you will come. You're going to confront the theater crowd. You're going to preach against sin. You're going to expose it with love. You're going to name their sins. And you're going to preach a sound doctrine of walking, forsaking their sins. And God in His mercy gave us the #1 theater in New York City because they had mocked Jesus there for 10 years. The Mark Hellinger Theater, Jesus Christ Superstar, played there for 2 years, mocking Christ. And it's one of the most beautiful theaters in New York City. And I just happened to stray in there one day and looking around, and we had no money to speak, and the Lord said, I'm giving you this theater because you've obeyed me. You're going to come here, and I'm going to turn this into a house of praise, and you're going to confront the sin in this city. And I'm going to save them from Broadway shows, and I'm going to save drug addicts, and I'm going to move mightily in this city. And the Lord miraculously gave us that theater. They've tried to buy it back from us many times. The Disney company wanted to buy our theater out. And the owner that sold it to us just begged and pleaded to get it back because it's one of the best music halls. But you see, the young man who played Jesus Christ Superstar was stoned the whole 2 years on heroin. And he played the part of Jesus while he was stoned. And the Lord saved him and filled him with the Holy Spirit. And he came and dedicated the church. And when he came into the church, he looked up, he said, boy, this is a beautiful place. I said, well, you were here 2 years. He said, I never saw it. He said, I was stoned. He said, could I go back into my dressing room? And I said, well, it's the pastor's study now, but sure, come. And he said, I used to worship the devil here. I'd put 1,000 candles and light them and dare the devil to come and blow them out. And one day, with all the windows, doors closed, they were all blown out. It so scared me. And my wife had gotten saved, and I knew I'd better get ready to meet God. God filled that church. And I tell you now, in 18 years, there's never been an evangelistic service without people being saved. And many nights, so many people come, the whole front is filled in the aisles all the way back into the lobby. And transvestites, drug addicts, rich and poor, 103 various nationalities, in all worshiping together, seeking the face of God. But you see, the only way I could reach, I remember the night, I think 7, 8 transvestites sitting together, men dressed as women. They looked pretty nice. I mean, beautiful women. They were men. And how do you stand there? You say, well, I don't want to offend them. I don't want to offend them. That's not the way to preach the gospel. You don't preach an offensive gospel. But I've got half an hour, maybe 45 minutes between them and hell. And I had better have a message. I have got to be able to say with love and brokenness what God's attitude towards sin is. I've got to explain that there's a hell. I've got to explain that there's judgment against sin. And I've got to pray Jesus, and I've got to say Jesus Christ can deliver you from drugs, from alcohol, and believe that with God nothing is impossible. And preach a sound doctrine without fear of offense. The apostles came to Jesus. His disciples said, "Do you know you offended the Pharisees?" He said, "Well, if that offends them," in essence what he said, how will they take this message then? They're going to drink my blood and eat my flesh. A very offensive message. We preached the law for 4 years. And grace. When we confronted New York City